Welcome to the American Subcontractors Association Killer Contract Clause webinar series. My name is Russell O'Rourke. I'll be your presenter for today. The title of this day's presentation is Scope of Work 1. We will have additional follow-up webinars on scope to provide more detail in some specific areas. The webinar highlights for today will have an introduction, qualification of your bid, we'll discuss industry best practices, and then some examples of over-inclusive contract language. All contract terms have value. Every clause has an intended meaning, obligation, or right. If it didn't, it wouldn't be there. Most people overlook the fact that there is some give and take that should be allowable in any contract negotiation, and if you're giving up one contract clause that you want in, you ought to balance it out, be able to get another contract clause back in, or an additional one modified or removed that doesn't suit your needs. The scope of work really is, if not the most, one of the absolute most important contract clauses. Sure, price, payment, all those various things that you have been taught over the years and that you just instinctively know are important are all important. But if the scope of work is wrong, they're really irrelevant. If you bid a job and you're going to be paid $1 million to do it, and you have a very specifically defined scope, but when the scope comes back and you sign a contract that has a different scope than you intended that doubled it, all of a sudden your $1 million contract should have been a $2 million contract, but you're stuck with exactly what your price is, even though your scope has changed. Be careful. Remember that people don't pay enough attention to the scope of work. Sure, in the bid, people look at it and tend to focus on it more there, but when it comes back, and when I say it, I mean the contract, the proposed contract that is being returned to you, it's going to be wildly different. The contract that is given back to you is, and this is specifically if you have qualified your bid, just a counteroffer. Unless your bid is expressly included in the contract, it's going to be excluded from the contract. Whatever has been substituted in the contract document is going to be exactly what your scope is. So be real careful with that whole concept. The scope of bid really is your best only chance to define what your scope is. Remember, that's where you put everything together, you married up your price versus your scope. And if you have them out of balance, you're going to be in trouble one way or the other. Your scope really should be, when you first prepare it in your bid and then ultimately when you have it in your contract, should be limited to exactly what you intended to do, the labor and materials you intended to supply, and related to the price that you've quoted. When you get the contract back, this counteroffer, read it carefully. Be sure you understand all of the terms and understand what they have done to your scope, because when you pay attention, you really will find that it has been widely expanded. If you've qualified your bid, you really do get to negotiate to keep your intended scope. If you weren't careful, you're going to run into the circumstance where the rule of law is that if you didn't qualify your bid, the document that they give you back, assuming that it has standard, readily acceptable contract terms, even a contract term that may be objectionable to you, like a pay if paid clause, if it's a standard in the industry, you should have anticipated it. And if you should have anticipated it and didn't want it, you should have excluded it. So qualify your bid and then negotiate your contract. Specifically negotiate your scope. When I say negotiate, I mean go sit down, work through it so you and they both know exactly what you're bidding on and what you meant to have as your scope. If in fact they have changed your scope, it may be okay, but you'll have to negotiate a higher price. You may not be able to do it. You might not have the labor force. You might not be able to buy the material or get it in the time period they want. But if you can, and it's expanded and it's something you want to do, try to negotiate a higher price so that it adequately covers you and compensates you the way you think you should be compensated. And remember, if you have qualified your bid and the contract terms are unacceptable or the scope is too large, you can decline the job. Now, that means you have to have qualified your bid correctly first. But remember, not having a bad job or not having any job is a heck of a lot better than not having a bad job that can really just put you out of business. Qualifying your bid is something that should just be second nature. You want to put in specific mandatory language, and the mandatory language may be coming from places like the consensus docs. Specify the use of the consensus docs 750. Specify the inclusion of the terms of the ASA Addendum to Subcontract 2008. Or if you have specific terms you like, be sure those are included. ASA was one of the original proponents and one of the major negotiators of the consensus doc documents. The consensus docs can be found at consensusdocs.org. They are for purchase. They aren't very expensive, but even so, if you're an ASA member, you'll get a discount on those prices. Call ASA at the main office in DC to get the discount code for you to use right on the website. To qualify your bid, you can also use the ASA Addendum to Subcontract 2008. That's being modified as we speak. There should be a 2010 or 2011 version in the very near future. That's free to ASA members. It can be found in the Contractor's Knowledge Bank at ASA Online once you log in. When you're qualifying your bid, be specific as you can about what you intend to do. Give them a laundry list of all the things you intend to do and perform. Now, once you do that, you want to avoid such language as all labor and materials necessary to do whatever, unless you have been very, very specific with no open ends, because if there's an open end, it will come back to haunt you. Be careful about adding exclusions. You want to put inclusions in. You can also exclude things. I am not going to do X or I'm not going to do Y. The only catch there is if you have failed to get all of the exclusions you want to have excluded and you come back later with the problem, they can point to your list of exclusions and say, if you meant to have more things excluded, you would have said so. So that can come back to show that you really had a different intent in mind when you were negotiating to hurt you. To help you with some of this stuff, you can look at some best practices. You can go to ASA Online again as a member, log into the Knowledge Bank. There are a ton of white papers there that can help walk you through. There's also a bunch of podcasts that can help explain things to you in a very easy format. So as a member, log into ASA Online. You'll find a ton of things to help. There's also a free ebook that ASA worked on with AGC and ASE. That can be found at constructionguidelines.org. It's called Construction Guidelines, Guidelines for a Successful Construction Project. I highly recommend downloading that and working through it. Some examples of over-inclusive contract language. This subcontract consists of the subcontract, etc., and all the terms of the contract between the owner and the contract. Here's the catch. In the event of a conflict between the terms of this subcontract and the other subcontract documents, the terms of the other documents shall control. You just negotiated your heart out on the terms of this contract document, and now something else is going to take advantage of you. How about this one? The contract documents and this agreement are intended to be complementary. So if anything required in one shall be of like effect as if required in both. Again, they're adding things back into you. You need to limit exactly what you're going to do. How about this one? In no event shall subcontractor be entitled to greater rights, higher entitlements, or more relief against the contractor than the contractor actually obtains from the owner on subcontractor's behalf. Well, what if the owner isn't giving anything because it was already in the contractor's scope? We have a bunch of other webinars coming up on a monthly basis, as well as the ones we'll stick in just to add additional information. Check back often and see what we have for you. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to seeing you in the future.